It's time to journey through sci-fi.
Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
My name is Matt.
This is a new sci-fi podcast where we're going to be talking all things sci-fi. So in this first episode, we're just going to be having a general chat about sci-fi, aren't we, Matt?
That's right.
Yep. So we're going to be talking through sort of like our favourite films, trying to really hash out what sci-fi is.
We'll go over a little bit of the history of sci-fi. We'll look at how it's changed over the years. And then we'll go into that in much more detail in the episodes that we're going to be doing in the future.
Exactly. So if you want to follow us, we are on Twitter. It's at Through Sci-Fi Pod. So that's at Through Sci-Fi Pod.
Or you can email us. What's our email address, James?
Our email address, let me just double check that now. It is journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com. Nice and easy to remember.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And yeah, we want to hear from you guys.
Let us know your favourite sci-fi films. Let us know your favourite sci-fi subgenres. Tell us about how you think the genre's changed over the years.
Definitely. And then, yeah, we can see where it takes us.
I want to know what your earliest memory of sci-fi is.
Okay, earliest memory of sci-fi. I think it's probably watching things like Transformers, like the Transformers movie, when that came out and I was really little. I think we used to go to this pub in Germany.
Really?
And they had this sort of separate kids room and they used to show kids films. And Transformers was like a big thing because obviously you've got these robots from a different planet. And at the time, you're so young, you don't really fully understand it. It's sci-fi or anything like that.
It looks cool.
Yeah, it looks cool. And I think from that sort of age, I realised sci-fi was something that it always looked cool.
Yeah.
And it was just different worlds and different things like that. And it was just very sort of imaginative.
Beyond good, beyond evil, beyond your wildest imagination. Transformers, the movie.
Amazing setup for a pub, by the way. Great shout from the Germans there. So you like the kind of the visuals of it and the whiz bangs, and that kind of got you into it.
Yeah, I think that's what initially drew me into science fiction as a genre. But after that, you grow up with it as well, and you understand different aspects of it. I think now, as an adult, I enjoy sort of more about the philosophical aspects of it and sort of how it reflects society and all that. It's very sort of like there's always more than just the initial surface layer of the gloss and sort of the special effects. There's always deeper stuff in a good science fiction film.
Absolutely.
Anyway. Yeah, so that's probably the first in that I got. What about you? So
my earliest memories are watching Star Trek with my dad. My dad raised me on sci-fi in general, but yeah, it was Star Trek, BBC Two. Next Generation was on after The Simpsons, one night a week. But definitely we had the original series on as well. Like really early memories of that. I can't remember when that would have been aired in the UK when I was a kid, but it definitely was.
That sort of 6 o'clock slot, wasn't it, on the BBC? They always had something good there.
Tea time slot, bit of sci-fi. My mum just, she didn't like it. She was always putting up with it barely. But yeah, I grew up with that. I kind of like a bit the same thing. I like the kind of, if there was a fight scene or something, that would have been like the most exciting bit for me when I was a little kid. And then I definitely like pushed back on that when I was a teenager. I thought that was really uncool and I was a bit embarrassed by how much Star Trek I'd watched for most of my life.
Because it does become like, we were chatting about this a little bit earlier, it becomes like a kind of a stigma.
Yeah.
There is that thing around sci-fi where it's kind of got that thing where people think that it's like a teenage boy thing and that's just it. But it has grown throughout the years.
It's definitely more mainstream today and it's safer to be a fan of sci-fi now without like having anything to be embarrassed about. But I came back to it, like I remember coming back to it like at university, getting back into Star Trek and watching it for the first time as an adult and really enjoying all those stories, that kind of overarching story. I think that's something I really like about sci-fi is the world building. And if it
Yeah.
wasn't, if I hadn't got into sci-fi when I was a kid, it would have been fantasy. Like it's got that same element, or it can have that same element of building a really detailed world. And that's why I love Star Trek in particular. The fact that it's this one franchise that's lasted for, 50, 60 years now.
Yeah,
And
it's got such a legacy now, hasn't it?
And building on that universe the whole time and just building it up and making it more and more detailed. And you get more out of it the more you invest into it, because you know a little bit about that alien species, so you can infer a little bit of context in a conversation, or you know how they're going to behave and stuff like that. And like I said, it lets you go back to kind of enjoying the other things that are happening in those stories. The more, if they're dealing with something philosophical or contemporary or something like that, you can enjoy that because you've got all that context already. Your brain's locked into that world and you can just sort of jump in and enjoy it.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its continuing mission: to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before.
With sci-fi as well, it's sort of invaded mainstream culture a lot more now. So if you think about when we were going to uni, Lost had come out recently.
Yeah.
Lost has so many sci-fi aspects to it. I mean, it's an island. There's a special machine they have to type in the code for every. I can't remember how long it was, but they're always typing in the code.
We should know that. Surely it must be related to the numbers, right?
Yeah. So it's things like that, and it's sort of like all these little things, and it's sort of, why is there a polar bear on the island?
Is it teleportation? Is it time travel? Is it aliens?
That's in the time travel aspect as well in the whole series, when they sort of like doing the flashbacks, and then suddenly the flashbacks become something that the characters are actually realizing are going on
when they travel back to the 1970s.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff. So like you had Lost, and you had stuff like Heroes coming out, and obviously when Battlestar Galactica got its revamp, and that came out as a TV series again. A massive sci-fi series, which got critical acclaim, and I think that kind of like revamped everything a little bit around about that time.
It brought a bit more grittiness to sci-fi that I don't think had been around for a while. What was that? 2003, 2004 that started.
Must have been about that, yeah.
And I think we'd been missing a bit of edge to sci-fi when that show started back up. That was amazing.
Yeah. Fantastic series. But yeah, going back to that that 6 o'clock slot.
Yeah.
That 6 o'clock slot always had the best stuff in. So there was like obviously all the Star Trek stuff. They had Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Buffy, fantastic. Do you remember they had the Twilight Zone on there at one point?
No, I've never seen it. I've never seen it. I know you love it, don't you?
Yeah, it is.
And I think I would love it if I watched it, because I read about like the plots and stuff, and they're such simple, smart plots when I read about them. And also, obviously, everything I watch will do a parody or a reference to a Twilight Zone episode at some point. Like there's like a dozen in The Simpsons.
It's just everywhere, isn't it?
They do it in every like show. So it's become like such a cultural sort of touchstone that I get the references. I know that it's a reference to the Twilight Zone, but I've never seen an episode.
Just things like with the narrator at the beginning of every episode and the sort of graphics they use.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
But yeah, so like they had the Twilight Zone on around about that time, and I'm pretty sure they used to show a sci-fi B-movie as well at one point, because I definitely remember watching The Blob.
I saw The Blob, when I was young. That was on. That's like a bank holiday movie film.
Yeah,
you know?
But I feel like it was sort of in that slot as well. They used to, they went through like a small patch on BBC Two or something. I might be completely making this up and have just got some sort of false memories.
It was definitely on TV when we were kids.
Yeah.
I kind of lumped that in my head with like Flash Gordon. Like that's another one that would always be on like a rainy day.
Flash Gordon.
I've seen that like 20 times.
It's Brian Blessed, isn't it? He's the Hawkman.
I love that movie.
Fantastic. Great soundtrack as well.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah. I mean, I still find myself sometimes going, Flash, every once in a while.
Yeah, we're stuck with that cleaning advert at the moment, though, which is
God.
kind of ruining that.
Horrendous. So what other sci-fi things do you remember sort of growing up? Was there anything in particular?
I know that I think Star Wars Episode 1 would have been one of my first cinema trips. Not my first. I remember going to some other ones before that, but I know that there was all that hype around, 97 with the re-releases
and they
of
had
the
the
originals.
gold box set on video. Yeah, when that came out.
So that was another one that my dad had sort of brought us up on because he taped it off TV, so we had it on VHS. So we were very familiar with it. And then we kind of got caught up in all of that hype with the re-releases. And then Episode 1 came out. And, it's a bad movie.
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, at the time, though, I remember being...
I
was thinking, this is the best thing ever.
Yeah.
It's a whole new Star Wars, and the special effects look great.
Yeah.
But then, flash forward a few years when I watched it as an adult again.
No, I've got the same memories. I know that we came out of it, and I was just like, I was a little kid. I was excited. I'd had a really great time watching it. What do you make of the new ones?
I've really enjoyed the new ones. So Force Awakens, so what I do each year is, because my birthday's in December,
Sure.
I will go, so since the new one came out, me and my sister have made it a tradition that we will go out and watch the latest Star Wars
that's
film.
nice.
If it's in December, sort of like when I go back to Kent.
Yeah.
So that's quite nice.
Oh, it's a nice grown-up tradition.
Yeah.
Nice to start that sort of thing.
I mean, I was a bit disappointed there wasn't one last year.
Because they did Solo
They
in the
did
summer,
Solo in
didn't
the
they?
summer, yeah. So
I haven't seen that
yeah.
yet.
The other 2 years, I was able to go and see Star Wars.
So I've not been the biggest fan of the new ones. Like, I went to the cinema excited about Force Awakens, and I just like, this is a retread at best, I thought.
Yeah, it is, but it's kind of like it's got all the things which I enjoyed about the original series. Obviously, it does follow all the same formula, and it's the same sort of narrative structure pretty much beat for beat.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the joy of it as well, because it's a whole new generation. Because if you think back to just what we were saying a second ago, when we first watched Episode 1, we were like, oh, this is amazing. But
Yeah,
then,
I had flashes of that watching it at the cinema, but overall it didn't quite catch me. Like, I remember thinking, scenes with like when the Falcon first like gears up and goes on its flight.
Yeah.
I remember being really pumped up for that, and I got goosebumps, and little moments like stupid stuff like BB-8 gives a little thumbs up gesture with his little light or whatever, and I really liked that when I saw it. But overall it didn't capture me, and then I laid off the others until they came on Netflix. I just didn't bother watching them, and then kind of got around to it. Like, Last Jedi was pretty good.
Yeah. I bet you enjoyed Rogue One, though.
I did, yeah. And I totally resisted it, and people were recommending it to me and telling me, and I was like, nah, I can't be bothered with these ones.
The beauty of Rogue One is because it is, you can watch it as a standalone film as well. You don't have to have all of that backstory. Obviously, it adds a whole new layer to it, but it's essentially a war film, though, isn't it?
A really good war film. The pacing, I just thought, is so good. It's like just such a straight line of kind of excitement from the start to the end, and by the end, you're really like locked in with this hopeless battle that they're doing, and I really enjoyed that.
I think, like, personally, I love all the sort of space opera kind of stuff that you get in all the other ones. So I think for Rogue One being such a realistic sort of telling of the Star Wars tale, part of the younger side of me was a bit like, it took me a little while, but obviously filmically, Rogue One is fantastic.
Yeah, and like what you're saying there about the space opera, they do a really good job of kind of moving away from that and making it more like a war movie. It's little things that you might not notice consciously, but like, it's little things like not doing the wipes and stuff, and the music is done so differently to not make it so space opera-y, and it's more gritty.
It's got a whole different sort of tone to it, hasn't it?
Why does she get a blaster and I don't?
What?
I know how to use it.
That's what I'm afraid of. Give it to me.
We're going to Jeddah. That's a war zone.
What is your favourite sci-fi movie?
Favourite sci-fi movie?
That's a tough one.
That is really difficult. One of my favourites is obviously Star Wars.
The original, you're talking the very first one.
I really liked Return of the Jedi when I was younger.
I did too. I think that was my favourite when I was a kid.
I think obviously Empire Strikes Back is the best one critically, and that ending when you find out that Darth Vader is Luke's father.
Yeah.
That, I mean, if anyone hasn't seen that, that's a spoiler which you must have found out by
I think people are born with that knowledge
Yeah.
now. It's like the Beatles. Like everyone just knows those songs when they're born. I think you're just kind of born with that information now. It's genetic.
You must do. It's in pop culture everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think Return of the Jedi, obviously, it was the final act of that trilogy, and the Forest of Endor I thought was great, and even the Ewoks I thought were fantastic.
I liked them when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Didn't annoy me.
Yeah. I mean, now they're a little bit more annoying.
Yeah.
They, yeah. But we used to have the Ewok film on VHS
no
as well.
way. Tell me about that. I have not seen that.
So, from what I remember about the Ewok film, this is going back a little bit now, but it was something like there was this evil king or something in a castle, and the Ewoks there was a kid helping the Ewoks out, and they had to sort of overthrow this guy. But it was fantastic at the time because it had all the Ewoks there. I think we even had the Ewok film before I saw Return of the Jedi.
What?
Yeah, I think that's the order that we did it in.
So you were watching Return of the Jedi like, wow, now this is a good movie about Ewoks.
That's it.
In the tradition of Return of the Jedi comes an action-packed motion picture for the entire family to enjoy.
If you can buy me some time, we just might have a chance.
A space-age fantasy daily variety praised for its superb special effects, clashes of near epic proportions, and imagination run rampant.
You let her go!
It's a tale of good versus evil, starring Cocoon's Wilford Brimley, and a heroic clan of lovable creatures that will warm your heart.
Oh, Vic, you're my very best friend. Best friend, best friend.
Ewoks, The Battle for Endor.
One of the ones which springs to mind usually is Eternal Sunshine, which may not be strictly a sci-fi movie, but it's one of my favourite films just in general.
Yeah.
And obviously it does have the sci-fi aspects because it explores the whole idea, what if you could erase memories of someone? And I think that is very
That's
much
a sci-fi trope that they're using. And I think that something so key about sci-fi as a genre is it's defined by the appearance of the tropes, right?
Yeah.
Because the films and the stories can touch on any themes and they can mix in with any genres. And what makes them sci-fi is the existence of those familiar tropes. Has it got aliens? Is it set in space? Is it got time travel? Is there stuff like memory wiping and stuff? Those are science fictional tropes, whereas that's a love story, essentially, isn't it? And that's the key part of that film is the love story, but it's using those sci-fi tropes. So I think it's a sci-fi film, and I think that's what makes most sci-fis sci-fis.
Exactly, and I think you're definitely you like hit the nail on the head there. Is that whole idea that a sci-fi can have so many different elements of other genres in there, but it's a sci-fi film by definition because of the way it's told.
It's like horror. Like horror is only really horror because. Is it frightening? Is this scary? But, it can be any genre horror. It can be a sci-fi horror. It can be a comedy horror. But it's those tropes of terror and scariness that bring it back into that sort of umbrella horror genre. And I think it's the same situation with sci-fi.
So what would you say the tropes are in sci-fi?
I was trying to think about this on the way here. So I was trying to think of something that would really explain it in a really clear way, but there is no simple way of doing it. Like a big thing is exploring those themes, exploring those genres using fictional technology. But then that doesn't quite cover it because you could have stories about aliens visiting us where the technology's not really used in the same way. It's foreign, it's coming from the aliens on that sort of side. Tropes like time travel would always go into a sci-fi kind of grouping for me. Like what are some other ones? What do you think?
Well, I think you have to sort of break it down to what exactly is sci-fi in its sort of core.
Yeah.
And I always think of sci-fi, it's the what if.
Yes.
So it's always about what if this happens? So what if man created a machine and then what would that make man if this machine had consciousness and that kind of thing? Or what if we lived in a world where aliens had come and then taken over and that kind of thing? It's always that what if.
What does it mean to be human given these scenarios?
Yeah, I think that is the main thing.
But I think the important thing, I guess, is exploring that question. What does it mean to be human? Actually, regardless of the scenarios, using those scenarios to ask the question, but really the question exists on its own. So we're exploring those themes about humanity in sci-fi, but they exist within humanity because they're there to explore.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a very interesting way of exploring those kind of themes because you can do it in such an imaginative way. You're not just telling sort of like, you could tell like a traditional political story or something like that, and you could tell it exactly how it happened here. Or you can put it, if you suddenly put it in a different society.
Don't get me started on Dune, James.
There we go, something
not
like
this
that. So Dune is like a perfect example because you've got like the spice trade and sort of like all of this sort
religion,
of like, and
ecology.
That's it, and the whole. I think religion as well is a big thing that comes into it because so much of sci-fi is dealing with sort of again what it means to be human, sense of morality. And that kind of thing in human beings.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's what comes out.
I think AI stories are a really good way into religious concepts because it's looking at what it means to create life, which obviously brings you onto the idea of playing God, which is a really big thing in AI stories. And the idea that you would have a created being that has an opinion on its creator obviously works for the relationship between human beings and whatever they believe about God.
Yeah.
So to kind of focus that into like one individual creature that's been created, like be it a Frankenstein monster or be it a robot in Ex Machina, they're looking at the being that created them, often with disdain, which I love. I find that really interesting that they would feel that sense of, they feel superior. They've been created by a being and they don't owe that being anything and they actually feel like they've gone and surpassed that being.
Yeah.
Which I think is often used as a commentary about religion and God.
And I think that's, so in our first sub-series, which we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence in detail.
Yeah.
So we're going to sort of like cover all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that is the core aspect of it, isn't it? Sort of what would happen and how are these films, which we're going to sort of be looking at later on in the series, how do they go about displaying this and how have things changed in terms of what we expect from machines and what we think will happen. If you look at the initial way that AI was depicted on screen, it's a whole different way to how we see robots and stuff in science fiction films now.
Yeah.
So that obviously they're not just, they've always been a machine to be used in some way, but then it's kind of about if this machine is conscious, what does that tell us about our society if we create something, and then how does that reflect in religion? And yeah, there's so many different crazy themes. So Matt, what would you say your favourite sci-fi film is?
Yeah, I knew it's only fair to ask.
Yeah.
That's such a difficult question. I think I might have to go with Aliens, and that's a controversial opinion.
Aliens, not Alien.
Yeah, the second one. I absolutely love it. And when we talk about kind of crossing over the genres and what they're exploring, obviously it's such a different film to the first one. And I love the first one as well, but I love the fact that they do something so completely different with that. On the face of it, it seems like such a simple change. It's like we had one alien in the first film, now we got loads. That's the plot. But it's a completely different take on that. It is the kind of militaristic view of that, of humans against this swarming alien menace, which is handled so differently to the one kind of stalking horror monster that's looming on the ship and picking off one by one.
That's the thing as well, because if you look at Alien and Aliens, Alien is very much, it's more of a horror sci-fi.
Yeah.
Whereas Aliens is very much...
I think for me, it's the definitive action sci-fi movie.
Yes.
And that's where it's taken that step away from the first one. I'm also a massive, massive James Cameron fan. And I just think he's so incredibly good at putting together a real piece of entertainment. And he just does that time and time again. And Aliens is right up there, top of the list for his best work, in my opinion. He's also great at sci-fi. He's got a real good understanding of those concepts. He's known for his big blockbusters, but he's also obviously no stranger to a bit more of the cerebral, sensitive side of sci-fi. Like The Abyss is obviously a really thoughtful, slow-paced sci-fi movie. So it's a really good companion piece to Aliens in the fact that it's so different.
I love The Abyss as well because it flips the idea on its head a little bit. So instead of going into the stars to find these aliens, you go into the abyss of the world under the water.
Yeah.
And that's it's such a simple concept, but it works so well.
Definitely.
Because obviously we haven't explored much of the ocean at all when it comes down to it.
Yeah, and we've got more chance of doing that than exploring space at the moment, as it sounds, as I understand it.
I mean, I don't know about that scientifically, but
I don't know.
I think the listeners will find out very quickly that we don't know too much about science. We know a lot about the fiction element of it.
Yeah.
But so if anyone else can help us out with the science aspects,
help us out. Don't call us out.
Yeah, please.
Yeah,
I think that's the best way of saying it. Yeah, help us out. Don't call us out.
You know what I always think when you talk about a favourite film, and not just like in sci-fi, but any genre, I always think about what film will I always watch if it's on TV or if I don't know what else to watch. What am I always going to put on? And Aliens, I just love it. I'm always satisfied by that film. That's why Die Hard's up there on my list. I love it. I'm always going to be happy to watch Die Hard. Stardust is on that list because I absolutely love that film.
I always feel that if I've sort of like got an emotional connection to a film by the end of it, and if I've really felt something whilst watching it and I'm properly invested, then that will score high on my list every day of the week. So it's films where you properly get into the storyline and you can identify with the characters.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I like films like Eternal Sunshine and Star Wars, because obviously you've spent that time with them over the trilogy. You're invested in the characters and their story. Obviously, they are like a little bit two-dimensional on occasion.
But you know what's interesting there is that they can be a little bit two-dimensional in Star Wars, but there's different ways to get you engaged in that story. So, for example, Star Wars is a good example of really good world building. That's why I think you're so invested by the end of Return of the Jedi. It's such a big, involved, well thought out world at that point. Whereas Eternal Sunshine, I think that comes down to really good performances. Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet are so good in that film. Yeah. That's what draws you in, and that's what gets you so hooked on it. I watched The Endless the other night.
Fantastic,
really good. And that's a kind of plot that I didn't know anything about it. You'd recommended it to me. A couple of other people had recommended it to me, and that's all I had really. That I went in with that. But the great thing about that plot in The Endless is it just sort of starts to spin out in a direction that you're not expecting, and it's incredibly weird, the story, but it's grounded by the two guys who I think wrote it and directed it.
They really did it all themselves.
Yeah, they Shane Carrothed it. And they are so good in those performances because the way they react to all the weird, insane stuff that's going on around them keeps you locked into that story, and you could really disengage from that. And it's very much the same thing with Jim Carrey's performance in Eternal Sunshine. If you weren't so locked into him running through his own brain, you'd lose it.
Yeah, that's it. You totally side with his character throughout the whole thing. So speaking about The Endless as well, have you seen Resolution, their other one?
No, it's not on Netflix. I really want to.
I'm going to have to lend you that.
Yes,
because we talked about, like, obviously talking about world building.
Yeah.
They created that first film.
Yeah.
And then when you watch The Endless, it's kind of like an Easter egg for anybody who's watched Resolution.
Yeah, like not a direct sequel kind of thing.
But you can see sort of like the characters and how that sort of, the two films are intertwined.
So we talked about favourite sci-fi films. What's your favourite kind of sci-fi? Because I just said Aliens as my favourite sci-fi movie. That makes me sound like I'm a big-time action sci-fi guy, but that's not really what I'm into. I'd say like my favourite kind of things are the more existential films that deal with... I love a sci-fi film or story that deals with the loneliness of space. I think that's a really interesting and compelling thing to see on film or in a book. I know you've read The Explorer, which is a amazing story with mostly just one character in space. And have you seen the film Silent Running?
Yes, Silent Running
really
is brilliant.
Good, gentle,
it's one of my favourites.
Yeah, haunting. I think sci-fi's the best genre for exploring that sense of loneliness because there's nothing more lonely than that. And you can also use it for quite horrific things as well. It's what makes the first Alien film work so well as horror, because it's that sense of isolation in space.
And again, that's a very human thing to deal with. And obviously these films depict all those kind of sort of like tropes and elements.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, because Moon, I think, is the other one which springs to mind.
Very good, yeah.
Like Moon. And obviously in Silent Running, the bit at the end where, I don't know if I can say this, it's a spoiler, but at the very end of the film, it's very emotional.
Yeah.
and it's got all these. Well, we're going to be. I think we'll discuss.
We'll
Silent
talk
Running
about that
later on in the
later. Yeah,
series.
I'm not sure which series
But-
will include that in, but it's a must-see sci-fi film. It's a real classic. It's an ecological sci-fi film, and I'm going to come back to Dune again because I absolutely love Dune. It doesn't get touched on as often as it should in sci-fi, but when those films and stories talk about ecological concepts, I find it really, really interesting.
Annihilation in this is a great example of
Yeah.
the sort of ecology thing. Obviously, it's a different way of doing
Yeah.
it. This space, which has been invaded by an alien. I'm trying to think of the best way to word it because it's quite complex.
It's quite hard to understand.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, I've read the book as well, but I still find it hard to put into words exactly what that film is dealing with.
I think it's an alien force, isn't it? It's an alien force that's kind of interacting and warping nature, and it's how the humans are dealing with that. But they are kind of enveloped into nature. Like the alien force doesn't really care that they're humans. It's just sort of doing what it's doing.
It's trying
to
to
the
put
environment.
everything into the same sort of thing. It's trying to make an amalgamation of all the different genetic species and stuff. I mean, I think I'm just using fancy words to try and make it sound like I understand what was going on.
Is it doing it on purpose?
I think it's just the way it lives, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, this is probably a bit of a complex film to try and dive into right now.
I'd need to watch it again, but I really enjoyed it, and it's a film that, and this is a bit of a get out clause that I'm about to say, but a lot of the time with films like that, you can really sort of enjoy the feel of the movie, and then let the more detailed stuff kind of sink into your brain a little bit later on and kind of digest it, which is what good art should be, I think. Not that there's anything wrong with sitting down and watching a couple of hours of Aliens and knowing exactly what you're going to get from start to finish, but to have that kind of digesting the more cerebral elements of it. Obviously, like a film like 2001, I think, is one of the greatest sci-fi films of all time, and it really sits with you. It's going to sit with you your whole life, like a lot of Kubrick films do. You watch it and you'll take in all of that plot, but there's things, well, maybe not even with 2001 first time, but it'll be sitting in your brain for the rest of your life, and then you can watch it again maybe 10 years later. I certainly did that.
And you take something else from it, don't you?
Yeah, and you have a different sense of it, and you can relate to different things. And especially that film, because it deals with aging, that's a good one to come back to after a big gap in your life and then see that again.
I think so. 2001 is pretty much it's such a landmark film in science fiction because it was the one which changed everything. So like before that, you had your 1950s sort of B movies and stuff, which were sort of coming out sort of here and everywhere. And then when 2001 came through and Stanley Kubrick's way of sort of, we had all these special effects, and
I still find those effects really impressive when I watch it. You know, the shots of the space station. And again, I think to non-sci-fi fans, it's such a... You'll see that space station for quite a long shot, just slowly rotating, or the insides of the sets, which are amazing in 2001. And I think this is more for film fans, just appreciating like the effort that went into creating them. Every time I see it, I'm blown away by the detail of that station.
Yeah, and the film deals with so much as well, because it literally goes from the dawn of mankind to sort of like us journeying into the stars and with that weird psychedelic 10-minute scene.
Yeah, it's a lot to take on.
Your mind is blown off that 10-minute scene.
But given kind of the nature of what that film's trying to talk about, it had to have that scope, didn't it? It had to be looking all the way back to the beginning of man to make whatever comments it's trying to make about the future of man and what we're potentially evolving into, or I don't know what's going on in that film, the forced evolution of the character.
And it's because of that, and because it was able to do so much in that space of time, that we were able to have films like Star Wars and like Star Trek: The Motion Picture,
definitely,
and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They all came out after that, and I know George Lucas and Steven Spielberg always say, because Stanley Kubrick was able to do that with 2001, it suddenly a light bulb came on in their heads, and they were like, okay, so we can make these films we've had in our heads for so long, and it's achievable.
Do you think 2001 killed the sci-fi B movie then?
I think in some way, I think it gave sci-fi, it made it seem more...
Gave it some credibility.
Yeah, credibility, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah, it suddenly gave it more credibility because B movies were cheap and they were sort of, they knew they'd have an instant audience, and they were churning them out, and then 2001 was so critically acclaimed.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
So what about how sci-fi started in film to begin with? So what would you say sort of the origin of science fiction in film has been, or science fiction in general? How did it begin?
So have you ever seen any of the, I think it's Georges Méliès?
Yep.
Stuff like Voyage to the Moon.
Yeah.
What would that be?
Is it A Trip to the Moon?
A Trip to the Moon, sorry.
It's one of those. I mean, I always call it Voyage to the Moon as well.
You know, that was early 1900s, or maybe even just before, maybe late 1800s.
I think it was. So I've got down here, A Trip to the Moon was 1902.
1902.
Yeah.
So he was using all that. I mean, I think his biggest interest was kind of camera trickery.
Yeah.
But obviously he was using those kind of Jules Verne sci-fi elements to just have an excuse to do some really cool, amazing, crazy-looking special effect because he had those skills and he wanted to explore it. I'm sure that must have sort of laid the seed of bringing those stories to life, because those stories existed. You know, people talk about Frankenstein, the novel, as being kind of the birth of sci-fi, the first science fiction novel.
So why do you think people say that? Why is Frankenstein? Because obviously most people hear Frankenstein and they instantly think of horror.
Sure.
But I think that's just the way things have developed.
Yep. Yeah, it got taken on as a kind of classic horror trope by like Hammer, I guess, and stuff. But it's that story of I believe he's like the original mad scientist. He's using what at the time would have been, well, it still is, futuristic, incredible technology to reanimate a body and create life. So it touches on those elements of playing gods and using technology using science to play God and do that. And in that way, I do think that Frankenstein kind of slots into the AI
definitely
world a little bit. It's got like traces of that, and definitely modern AI movies do have that creator-creation relationship.
So if you look at
something in Frankenstein,
if you look at something like Ex Machina, Ex Machina is basically a Frankenstein story,
definitely,
but just a modern day one. And a few different twists and turns along the way.
Yeah.
But essentially it's a similar sort of narrative.
And I think you always kind of want to see Dr. Frankenstein get his just desserts, you know?
Yeah.
Or maybe that's more of a modern thing. I always find myself siding with the Frankenstein, with the creation. I want to see them kind of break free, and if that involves going on a bit of a rampage, then hey, we're going to see some humans die on this film.
It's interesting that, isn't it? Because you would think automatically you would side with the humans, but with a lot of these films, you do kind of find yourself siding with the plight of the creation.
Yeah.
Which, I think it's more sort of, it's quite telling about how we're depicting humanity in a lot of these films.
I think it's because it's making us look and be critical at our own flaws as a species, that we have this sort of greedy desire for power and to be able to do these ridiculous things with technology, and that I guess there must be a bit of a latent sense of guilt about that, right?
Yeah.
And that's why these films work so well. And maybe not guilt, but maybe it's fear of like what that power could mean and what it could turn into.
I think that's it. And obviously film is, like the way film is now, it's the perfect way of getting these sort of questions across to audiences. And then you watch a film like Ex Machina now, and you suddenly think about all the different, like I think with Ex Machina as well, it's very difficult to find a character who's in the right in that film.
Yeah.
Because everyone has some sort of ulterior motive, and you want to side with the robot, but at the same time, you can't.
Oh, I absolutely side with the robot in that film, James.
But then by the end of it, it twists that on its head a little bit, and you're kind of like,
because we're supposed to be going in as Domhnall Gleeson's character, and he sides with the robot, and that is used against him. With, again, spoiling it a little bit, but it's that you don't want to feel manipulated by that character. But I think that's what makes those characters so interesting. If they are doing those things, like doing something manipulative, should be something that is not celebrated, but it's what makes them so human, and that's what makes them so interesting and likable. Like Roy Batty in Blade Runner, he's got that kind of, he's got such a dim view of humanity, so looks down on humanity because he, as he says in his amazing speech, you know, he's seen all these amazing things that you couldn't possibly understand because you're just a human. And as a human, you know, maybe you should feel a bit like, oh, like, who's this guy?
Yeah.
But of course, like, that is what makes him so human.
That is such an emotional scene as well, with the rain pouring down, and it's just
he's showing his appreciation for beauty and like the tragedy that he can't see any more of it, and the just so much frustration that he's feeling at trying to explain this to some schmuck who couldn't possibly understand.
Typical Harrison Ford, always playing a schmuck.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
Why do you think sci-fi has such a cult following? Why do you think people are so invested?
I think that one of the elements of it is what we were talking about before, which is that you get more out of sci-fi the more you put in a lot of the time. And because it does alienate others as well, you've got those two streams of maybe alienating new viewers at the same time as rewarding old viewers through the world building, or sometimes it's just using tropes that you're so familiar with and using them really casually. Like if you're making a sci-fi film, sometimes you can drop in a concept very quickly and easily. Time travel is a great example of that. I think if you make a time travel film now, you don't have to spend any time in the exposition explaining how your time travel is going to work, unless you're doing something unique with your concept in your movie. Yeah. You don't need to explain it. It's just, this is happening. They're in a different time period. There might be repercussions. We might explore that.
I think that's it. It's because sci-fi has embedded itself into mainstream culture so much. So like you said, like, you know how a time travel film works.
Yeah.
There's such a wealth of time travel films out there. People understand already how...
Yeah.
Because if you look at Netflix have just done that series Russian Doll.
Yeah.
Which,
is that a time travel series?
Well, it's kind of, because she's on a loop.
Oh, yeah.
So she keeps dying and coming back. And again, that kind of thing happens all the time in all these different sci-fi
That's
films.
a well-established trope, yeah. And you can jump straight into that. And it's that ability to just deploy those tropes, which is a bit of a reward for fans of that genre. And yeah, maybe I haven't seen Russian Doll, but if you turn that on and you've not really watched a lot of sci-fi in your life, you might be annoyed a bit with what they're doing with time loops and stuff if it's not handled well.
Yeah.
And that's how you get into a cult thing. But you're right, it has gone way beyond cult status now. It's incredibly mainstream as a genre. But that would be why it was in that kind of cult world before, I think.
Yeah. And what do you think about, obviously some of the ideas and some of the inventions which are depicted in science fiction films? Because obviously science fiction is it's about technology a lot of the time. So you get things which were in science fiction films before, which are now actually a reality.
Sure.
So can you think of any sort of like other elements like that? Because the first thing which I always think of is like the communicators in Star Trek.
Yep.
They're basically mobile phones.
Well, I wouldn't... So I definitely heard, I don't know if this is true or not, that stuff like automatic doors, sliding doors, the people who developed that and invented that in real life were inspired by watching Star Trek. That's something that came straight out of Star Trek. So, I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised if like the little flip phone communicators they had on the original Star Trek fed into flip phones that we had when we were young men a couple of decades ago.
That's mad though, isn't it? Because if you think, so obviously we're not quite there with flying cars and that kind of thing, but obviously these ideas which are being shown in all these films, give it a few days.
There's such a feedback loop between technology and science fiction. Like science fiction has these lofty ideas about what could be, and it inspires a generation. It's not like 2001's not just inspiring a generation of filmmakers, it's inspiring a generation of kids who grow up to be scientists and engineers who are really developing these technologies, and that's why we have them. And then, of course, those technologies inspire the filmmakers, and they think up not more interesting, but more new, interesting ideas that kind of continue that thought process. And then we get more stuff, and that's why you get really interesting. There's a lot of films out at the moment, like Her, where they're dealing with, like 5 years, 10 years in the future kind of technology, really believable. We're so close to that kind of technology. It's hardly even futuristic. It's more just like a flip side of something we already have.
So, I mean, if you go back to like Metropolis, which was the first full-length science fiction film, if you go back to that, and that was, I think it must be like 100 years ago or something like that now.
Nearly, yeah.
Yeah.
If not already.
And they were, I think it's 2025 or 20...
Is that when it's set?
That's when it's set, yeah. And that's so close to now.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure if it's definitely one of that. It's around about that time.
Yeah.
So, so it's 100 years ago, and they've imagined this world. And then we're getting so close to a lot of the ways which they imagine things would be.
Yeah, it's amazing that they actually set it so far in the future, actually, at that time, because you see a lot of sci-fi, like even, like Terminator 2 was set, when was Judgment Day in that? It was like 1997,
I think it was, for the 2K, because it was,
right.
Yeah.
And that was only a few years in the future, and obviously that becomes dated really quickly, and like Star Trek talks about the eugenics wars happening in the 1990s, and then in the later series they sort of nudge that forward a bit, and then they're always kind of like catching up with themselves. Like sci-fi does have a tendency to, maybe those earlier films and TV shows didn't know how long they would last in the public consciousness, so they just set stuff like 50 years in the future, and then actually people are still watching it in 50 years time, which is crazy.
So I was talking a little bit with our friend Mike recently.
Sure.
So sci-fi, there used to be lots of films set in space and sort of like that kind of thing. It's kind of, there are more of the sci-fi films now which are coming out are set here on Earth.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you think there's been sort of a sort of like a trend with that?
There's definitely a shift, and I think that we'll have a good opportunity to like really get into that in the AI films that we're going to look at, because AI's become a really big theme, I think, in modern sci-fi, because we are looking at a world now that is full of artificial intelligence that's incredibly lifelike and increasingly lifelike as the years go on. And that's a great way for those movies to kind of touch on what that means for our society. But of course, it's going to also create more feedback loops of just creating the technology. You might have a film where, like Her, that we just talked about, is a good example of maybe the technology is not such a good thing in that film.
Yeah.
But I'm sure certain phone makers might look at that film and think,
Her's really interesting because it doesn't deal with artificial intelligence per se. It deals with, obviously it does, but it deals with how that affects us more as a species. And it's more sort of like looking into ideas of the soul and the emotional effects
of the technology that we're using. Yeah,
exactly. And so often with sort of AI films and that kind of thing, they deal with what's happening with the AI.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to have a film which is sort of dealing with the direct emotional aspects that...
Is it Joaquin Phoenix?
Yeah, Joaquin Phoenix.
He's very good in that, and he's giving a really good performance of a very lonely man, but he doesn't... It's a very subtle performance.
Yeah.
There's a lot of him just sort of staring forwards, and you get a real sense of what's going on in his head.
Yeah. And it's quite close to the bone as well, because if you think of things like dating apps now and all that kind of stuff, and everyone's on their phones all the time, so they're stuck in their like little worlds. So something like that it hits a lot of those notes.
So the question that got us onto that was how has sci-fi changed? So I think we're seeing a lot more AI films. Like, what other topics do you think are touched on now that have replaced those space exploration themes?
Well, with a lot of these sci-fi films at the moment, they're dealing with what's going on, because the political landscape at the moment is pretty rocky, both in the UK and the US.
Yeah.
And obviously that's filtering into a lot of the films which are being made, scripts which are being written, that kind of thing. And that, I think, those kind of tensions are coming out more.
Like Arrival is a really great film about communication, but, and language barriers and stuff. Like maybe one of the best films about communication, in my opinion. It's really good. So there is a lot of scope for those movies that are filled with a sense of existential dread. Is that too negative
when we're
talking
I think
about
that is true, though.
Yeah, Annihilation definitely had that sense to it, which was just not understanding what's going on around you and being quite scared of it. But also all of those characters just sort of march through those movies without having a breakdown when they would be well within their rights to have a complete breakdown. The two brothers in The Endless, two guys dealing with an incredibly insane thing in just a really realistic and believable way, but just sort of getting their heads down and getting on with life. It's kind of like they
stumble along it upon it all, don't they? Because
I find it very relatable, that kind of getting on with things and just doing it and getting through it because you have to. I don't know if it's just because of where I'm at in my life, being 30 years old and you've just kind of like got to roll with the punches and get on with your life. Even when you don't quite understand what's going on in the world around you, that's what makes that sense of dread and watching characters who just get on with it, even though they don't particularly like it and they certainly don't understand it.
Yeah.
I find that really relatable. I don't know if it's just the age I am or
I think
the world we're living in now, but I really like that. So what are the really successful sci-fi movies at the moment? I think we need to talk about the Marvel films a little bit because they have a bit of a foundation in sci-fi. Obviously, the fact that Iron Man launched that franchise, and that is absolutely a sci-fi movie, but then the wider universe goes off into fantasy elements with Doctor Strange and Thor, but it comes back to those sci-fi elements because those superheroes,
At the core, it's become more of a, like in the latest Infinity War, dealing with space, and obviously Guardians of the Galaxy was hugely successful, and that was all set in space and different worlds and alien races and that kind of thing. And then it's the world building aspect, and obviously Marvel is so interconnected, in the same way that sort of Star Trek is, and like those kind of serial TV series. I think they've created such a massive world and interconnected all these different characters. It can be quite, like we said before, it's quite intimidating to someone coming into a film like that.
Absolutely.
You feel like you have to have all this prior knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think that is something which deters a lot of people from sci-fi films sometimes. They feel like they have to know all these things.
And I think that's a problem that the comic book industry has had for decades, hasn't it? There's countless relaunches of the DC and the Marvel universes just to get in those new readers. And it's really interesting that actually those films might be finding themselves in that same place now. Like, if you haven't seen it from Iron Man, you might not want to watch Infinity War.
Yeah.
You might have stayed around and just watched the odd one here and there, but it's going to get to a point where they're probably going to do a relaunch. But I think that's kind of in the works, isn't it? Because obviously the actors are kind of coming to the end of their contracts.
I think they're just about to do a massive reboot of it all. But yeah, going back to that idea of having to have the prior knowledge to watch some of these films.
Yeah.
Prime example, my sister took my stepdad, who is in his 60s, to go and watch the latest Avengers film.
Okay.
He enjoyed it, but he didn't really know what was going on.
Has he seen any of them before?
He hasn't seen, I think he's seen like Iron Man and maybe Thor and stuff like that. But
it's a film that I really enjoyed the most recent Avengers film, but it definitely it cashes in on a character drops in a cool way, like when Thor shows up for the big fight and stuff, like characters who you haven't previously seen talking to each other, having a little funny one-liner with each other, which again, it's that little bit of reward for the long-term viewer, because it's just rewarding you for your knowledge of these characters by giving you a little bit of funny dialogue or whatever. But your stepdad's getting nothing out of that exchange between the raccoon and Thor.
But yeah, and again, like we said, it's got elements of different genres in there. But I would say it is essentially science fiction.
Yeah, for the most part.
Because they're all embedded in reality. So whereas like a fantasy film is based on magic to an extent.
But I mean, there's a lot of that in the Marvel universe, isn't there? Like Doctor Strange is, I wouldn't call him a sci-fi character. He's more into the fantasy element, and so is Thor, really.
But Thor's like an alien race.
Yeah,
That's
they tie
basically how they
tie
do
it
that.
back to the sci-fi in a nice way.
Yeah, and I think even Doctor Strange, it starts off that there's some sort of alien thing.
He's empowered by the Infinity Stone.
Yeah, so it always comes back to, they always try and root it in reality somehow now. But
and that's probably getting its history from the the 60s comic books where sci-fi would have been a huge influence on them.
Yeah.
And again, it's what we were talking about world building and how rewarding that can be as a viewer. Unfortunately, that's such a big trend in cinema at the moment that everything has to be a franchise. Are you ever worried that that's getting in the way of more films like Arrival and Ex Machina? They're quite low budget movies, so I guess the stakes for the studios are not too high to put those films out. But are we seeing all of the interesting, unique stories that we could be seeing if there wasn't such a stranglehold from the Marvel universe and the DC films?
Well, it comes down to film industry, doesn't it? Because obviously all of these companies, they want to keep making sequels and keep getting the audience. So I think part of them feel that it's more of a risk sometimes to put out a film which might be fantastic, but it might not have a built-in audience all the time. It's an unknown, isn't it?
It's a more guaranteed return on investment to make a third Ant-Man movie than to produce a unique, interesting script about communicating with aliens, to come back to Arrival.
But then you've got Netflix, and Netflix are putting out an abundance of different sci-fi films at the moment. They may not all be great, but at least they're sort of putting out more independent films and they're standalone, which is nice.
Yeah, it was interesting how they picked up Annihilation. I think it was supposed to have a cinematic release, and I've read something, again, I don't want to say something that's completely wrong, but I've read something from Alex Garland saying that was shot for cinema. And obviously I think he was very grateful that it was picked up by Netflix, that it would get that audience, but that wasn't quite how he intended people to see it.
Yeah, I think that is the thing as well. When you're watching some of these new sci-fi films on a streaming service, they seem a bit more disposable. Whereas the ones which hit the cinemas, you feel a bit more excitement about it. You go and watch it. Because I remember when the rebooted Star Trek series came out, and that first film was something you had to go and see at the cinema.
Definitely.
And the sound was amazing, all the different things they did with that. It was one of those things where you had to be in that space to get the most out of it.
As a lifelong Star Trek fan, going to the cinema and seeing that in the first, 20 minutes or so, where it's on Kirk's father's ship and it's being destroyed, that was amazing. Just an absolutely mind-blowing scene. Kirk being born and then the Romulan ship sweeping through.
But again, that's got the built-in audience again, which you were talking about.
Absolutely,
so they're always going to get... I think that's part of the reason they're rebooting so many of these sci-fi films. So RoboCop had its reboot, and I'm trying to think of others. There've been quite a few recently which have just been rehashed, redone.
Yeah, it's that built-in audience, but it doesn't always mean built-in quality, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's still an exciting time with sci-fi films.
Yeah, definitely.
Because obviously they've got all these big blockbuster ones being made. There is still space for these more interesting, lower budget sci-fi films. And I think it is so easy to make films now. People are making films on their iPhones. It's thinking of inventive ways. Something like Primer, that was very low budget, but the concept is very high concept at the same time.
Yeah, and it's a film that couldn't exist without an understanding of those tropes and that concept. Because if you were not familiar with time travel movies, that film would be unintelligible. And it's pretty hard to understand, for a fan of that genre. But it's what makes it such an interesting, exciting film.
Yeah, that's it. Because things like Schrodinger's cat, that's only something I have an understanding of from watching science fiction films.
So thanks very much for listening to our first episode. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. There'll be more coming in the future. We'll be starting our first series very soon. What are we going to be talking about in our first series, James?
So we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence.
Cool.
So in the next episode, we're going to be looking at Metropolis and Blade Runner. So we'll be talking about those two films and discussing a lot more about sort of how they've sort of changed the way sci-fi is and sort of looking at both of them in comparison, sort of taking it from there.
A couple of cool robot movies.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've got lots of robots to come on the podcast, so look out for that.